The men of Providence Gulch had 100 words for snow. They spoke of powder snow in reverent tones the way a priest might speak of communion wine. They knew sugar snow, the dry crystalline dust that squeaked beneath a boot sole like ground glass. They cursed settlers' sorrow, the heavy wet blanket that bent roof beams and broke the backs of horses. They feared corn husk snow, the wind-driven rasp that scoured exposed skin raw in minutes. They respected blanket snow, the silent killer that fell through the night without a whisper, burying doors and windows, turning cabins into sealed tombs by morning. Every man in the territory had his own vocabulary for the White Death that came each winter, a lexicon born of hard experience, of fingers lost to frostbite of cattle, frozen upright in the fields like grotesque statues. But not one among them had a word for what was coming. The autumn of 1887 arrived in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, not with the usual slow surrender of color, but with a sound. A low hum almost below the threshold of hearing vibrated through the granite bones of the hills. The aspens dropped their gold in a single week as though the trees themselves were stripping for a fight. The creek that fed the town's mill wheel ran thin, its current sluggish, water carrying a mineral taste that the old-timers said meant the deep aquifers were already pulling inward, hoarding their warmth. The sky took on a quality that no painter could have captured, a pale bruised lavender that pressed down on the landscape like a lid being slowly closed on a box. Elara Voss felt it before anyone else, though she would not have called it intuition. Intuition was for the ranchers who tapped their barometers each morning, for the loggers who could read the angle of a cloud formation the way a scholar reads Latin. What Elara felt was simpler, crueler. It was the hollow ache in her bones where grief had taken up permanent residence, a cold that lived inside her now independent of the weather. Her body had become a barometer of a different kind. It measured not atmospheric pressure, but the weight of absence, the specific gravity of a life subtracted from the world. Caleb Voss had been dead 6 months. He had not been taken by the hazards that claim most men on the frontier. No runaway horse, no snapped cable in the timber mill, no Lakota arrow from the diminishing skirmishes that still flared along the territory's ragged edges. A fever had done it, a common, ordinary fever that had appeared on a Tuesday morning as a slight flush across his cheekbones progressed by Wednesday evening, to a delirium in which he called out for his mother in County Cork, consumed him entirely by Thursday noon, with a heat that turned his skin papery, then released him on Friday at dawn, with a final shuddering exhale that sounded to Elara like the last breath of a bellows in a dying forge. 4 days, their entire future, every plan they had carried across the Missouri River in a wagon loaded with tools and seed corn, every whispered conversation in their marriage bed, about the children they would raise and the orchard they would plant. All of it incinerated in 4 days by a fire that burned from the inside out. He left behind 3 things: a half-finished log cabin whose walls rose to the height of a man's chest on 3 sides, but whose 4th wall remained a skeleton of bare uprights, open to the wind like a mouth frozen mid-sentence. A debt of $47.30 to Mr. Polk's provisioner store, a sum that might as well have been $47,000 for all Elara's ability to pay it. A silence so complete that it had its own texture, its own weight, its own particular way of filling a room until the air itself felt thick enough to choke on. She was 23 years old. In Providence Gulch, a young widow without kin was not a tragedy. Tragedies were dramatic, public, momentary. A young widow without kin was something worse. She was an inefficiency, a variable that did not fit the equation the town had written for itself. The community operated on a precise arithmetic of labor resources survival. Every person had a function. The men felled timber, drove cattle, broke sod. The women bore children, preserved food, maintained the domestic machinery that kept the men functional. A widow with children could be absorbed. She could be married off to a man who needed a mother for his own brood, her grief conveniently repurposed as domestic utility. But a widow without children, without family, without even a completed house to offer as dowry was a loose thread, Pull it, the whole weave might unravel. Leave it, it's snagged on everything. The women of the town were kind to Elara in the specific way that people are kind to a problem they wish would solve itself. Loaves of bread appeared on her doorstep wrapped in cloth, but never accompanied by a knock or a greeting. Quiet condolences were offered in the street, brief murmured sentences that began with the Lord's will, or time heals, before trailing off into the safer territory of weather observations. Their eyes, though, told the real story. Behind the sympathy lived a calculation as precise as any figure in Mr. Polk's ledger. Who would take her in, whose household budget would absorb this additional mouth, whose husband might begin to look at this young, unattached woman with something other than pity? Elara saw those calculations. She felt them like the draft that found every gap in her unfinished walls. She responded by becoming smaller, quieter, less visible. She took to gathering firewood before dawn when the streets were empty. She drew water from the creek in the blue-gray hour before the other women arrived with their buckets. She was learning the geometry of shame, how to occupy space without being perceived, how to exist at the margins of a community that had already begun to erase her. Providence Gulch itself was a monument to a very particular philosophy. It had been hacked out of the Black Hills with the furious energy of men who believed that the wilderness was an insult requiring a response. The ponderosa pines that once carpeted the surrounding slopes had been felled with a determination that bordered on rage, dragged down the ravines by teams of oxen, stripped of bark in the mill yard, then hewn into the massive timbers that formed the town's signature architecture. Every structure in the gulch made a statement. The cabins were large, their roof lines steep, their proportions designed to impress rather than to shelter. They were declarations of war against the vast indifferent sky monuments, to the conviction that human will, properly applied, could beat back any force that nature chose to deploy. The master architect of this defiance was Josiah Hargrave. He was 54 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who work with stone look older, as if the material's permanence leaches something vital from the craftsman's own flesh. His hands were enormous, scarred across every knuckle, the fingers slightly crooked from old fractures that had healed without being set. His shoulders had the permanent forward hunch of a man who had spent decades bending over workbenches, hoisting beams, muscling reluctant joints into alignment. His face was a landscape of deep lines carved by wind-sun sawdust. His eyes, set beneath a heavy brow that shadowed them even at midday, were the color of the granite he quarried from the hillside. They held the same quality, a density that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. He had built nearly every structure in Providence Gulch. The church, with its proud, slightly leaning steeple that he refused to correct because he claimed the lean gave it character. The saloon, whose hewn log walls were so thick that a man could fire a rifle inside without the report being heard in the street, a feature that had proven useful on more than one occasion. The provisioner store with its deep covered porch where Mr. Polk conducted business on summer afternoons. The schoolhouse, the smithy, the row of workers' cabins along the creek, identical in their proportions, their dovetailed corners fitted with a precision that made visiting carpenters from the lowland towns whistle through their teeth in admiration. His homes were his signature, massive timbers joined with obsessive precision. A grand stone hearth in every main room built from fieldstone he selected, personally rejecting 9 out of every 10 for invisible flaws. In front of each hearth stood the true centerpiece of civilization, a cast-iron stove shipped by rail from a foundry in St. Louis, then hauled by ox cart over 60 miles of rutted trail to the gulch. These stoves were the collective pride of the town, black ornate stamped with the foundry's eagle and flame insignia. They consumed firewood with a relentless appetite that their owners chose to interpret as a sign of vigor rather than a warning. But Josiah Hargrave was more than a builder. He was the town's foundation, in every sense a man whose opinions carried the weight of the structures he erected. When the town council met, it was Josiah who spoke last, because his word was the one that settled every debate. When disputes arose over property lines or water rights, it was Josiah who arbitrated his judgments as square and final as the corners of his buildings. He was not elected to any office. He did not need to be. His authority was architectural. It was built into the walls of every home, mortared into every hearth. To question Josiah Hargrave was to question the roof over your own head. What no one in Providence Gulch knew what Josiah himself had buried beneath decades of labor, the way a man buries a body beneath a stone floor, was the origin of his obsession. 12 years earlier, in the winter of 1875, during his first season in the Gulch, he had been a different man. Younger, leaner, not yet calcified into the monument he would become. He had built his first shelter with the same materials available to everyone else: green timber mud, chinking a roof of split shingles that leaked in 3 places. It was adequate. He had told himself it was adequate. Martha, his wife, had not complained. She was not a woman who complained. She had wrapped their son Thomas in an extra blanket, positioned his cradle near the stove, gone about the business of survival with the quiet competence that frontier women cultivated like a crop. Thomas was 3 years old. He had Josiah's heavy brow and Martha's pale blue eyes, a combination that gave his small face an expression of perpetual serious inquiry, as though the world were a puzzle he was close to solving. On the night of January 14th, a temperature inversion settled over the Gulch. The air at ground level dropped to 30 below zero. The stove consumed its fuel by midnight. Josiah woke at 2 in the morning to a cabin so cold that his breath did not form vapor. It froze, instantly falling back onto his face as a fine crystalline dust. He rebuilt the fire with hands so numb he could not feel the splinters driving into his palms. He fed it everything he could reach without leaving the cabin. A chair, the handle of a broom, pages torn from the family Bible, the thin paper flaring bright, then gone. By dawn, the cabin had warmed enough for breath to become visible again. Martha stirred under her pile of blankets. Josiah went to the cradle. Thomas was not cold. He was something beyond cold, something for which the language had no adequate word. He was still. The particular absolute stillness of a body from which every trace of the animating force has been withdrawn. His small face held no expression of pain or fear. He looked merely patient, as though he were waiting for someone to explain to him why the warmth had stopped. Josiah never spoke of that night, not to Martha, who understood without words, not to the men who worked alongside him in the years that followed, not to the Reverend Gideon, who had tried once gently to draw the grief out of him like poison from a wound. Josiah simply walled it up. He built over it. Every cabin he constructed after that night was larger, thicker, more aggressively insulated than the one before. Every stone hearth was more massive, every stove more powerful. He was not building homes. He was building fortifications against a specific memory, sealing it behind layers of dovetailed timber, burying it under tons of fieldstone, drowning it in the roar of iron stoves consuming cord after cord of pine. The irony, which Josiah could not see because it was too close to his own face, was that his cure contained the seeds of the same disease. The cabins grew larger. Their ceilings soared higher. Their proportions became grander. But the fundamental physics of heat did not change to accommodate his grief. Hot air rose to those magnificent ceilings while the floors remained cold. The massive stone chimneys, uninsulated, became conduits that sucked warmth out of the rooms like straws drawing the last drops from a glass. The gaps between the huge timbers, sealed with mud, chinking that dried and cracked and fell away each autumn, required constant maintenance that grew more demanding as the structures aged. Each cabin was a beautiful, intricate machine for losing heat, its every grand proportion a liability, its every proud dimension a vector for the cold. The town's firewood consumption reflected this hidden flaw. To feed the iron stoves required a staggering quantity of fuel. The surrounding hillsides, once thick with ponderosa pine lodgepole aspen, were beginning to show the scars. From certain vantage points, the forest looked moth-eaten, pockmarked with clearings that grew larger each season. This year, the logging crews had been driven back from the high country by early freezes that turned the trails to ice. The communal woodpile behind the church, which should have been a towering wall of split timber by October, was barely half its usual height. A quiet rationing had begun. Families who once burned freely through the nights now banked their fires at sundown. The saloon closed 2 hours earlier than usual, its great stove allowed to cool. No one spoke of the shortage above a whisper because to acknowledge it would be to admit that the town's entire philosophy, build big, burn, hard, conquer the cold with sheer force of will, might contain a fatal miscalculation. Elara's cabin. Caleb's unfinished ambition was a Hargrave design in miniature. It had the same steep roofline, the same thick timbers, the same pretension to grandeur, but where Josiah's completed structures at least maintained a veneer of functionality, this half-built skeleton offered only the illusion of shelter. The chinking between the logs, a mixture of mud and prairie grass that Caleb had applied hastily before the fever took him, was already crumbling. Wind penetrated through dozens of fissures, creating a constant low moan that varied in pitch with the strength of the gusts, a sound that Elara had come to think of as the cabin's own voice, a mournful commentary on its own inadequacy. Her stove, a second-hand model purchased on credit from Mr. Polk, was smaller than the standard Gulch issue. It consumed her meager woodpile with the same indiscriminate hunger as its larger cousins, but produced barely enough heat to warm a circle 3 feet in diameter. Beyond that radius, the cold owned the room. She spent her days in a grim routine of scavenging. Before dawn, she walked the creek bottom, gathering fallen branches, stripping dead bark from stumps, collecting pine cones by the armful. Her hands, once smooth, were now a network of scrapes, raw patches where the skin had been abraded away by rough bark, small cuts from sharp-edged stones that refused to heal in the cold. She carried her harvest back to the cabin, stacked it beside the stove, with the careful precision of a miser counting coins, then watched it disappear, stick by stick, into the iron mouth that was never satisfied. The end came on a Tuesday in early October. The sky that morning was the color of a lead bullet, a uniform metallic gray that pressed down on the gulch with almost physical weight. The wind had shifted during the night, swinging from its usual westerly course to a direct north bearing that carried on it a new quality, a sharpness, a crystalline edge that cut through clothing as though the fabric were not there. The aspens along the creek had been stripped bare overnight. Their white trunks stood like bones against the gray hillside. 3 heavy raps on the cabin door. Not a knock, an announcement. The sound traveled through the thin walls, through the gaps, and the chinking reverberating in the small space like a judge's gavel. Josiah Hargrave filled the doorway. He did not wait to be invited. He stepped past Elara the way a man steps over an obstacle in his path, his massive frame compressing the cabin's interior into something that felt less like a room than a cage. Behind him, visible through the still open door, stood Mr. Polk, the provisioner. Polk was a thin man with the permanent stoop of someone who spent his life bent over a ledger, his eyes magnified by spectacles that sat crookedly on a narrow nose. He carried a leather-bound account book pressed against his chest like a shield. Josiah's eyes swept the room with professional contempt. The unfinished walls, the gaps in the chinking where daylight showed through like tiny accusatory eyes. The pathetic stack of kindling beside the coal stove, enough fuel for perhaps 3 hours. The bedroll on the floor because Caleb had never built a proper bed frame. The small wooden chest at the foot of the bedroll, the only piece of furniture that suggested permanence. His gaze cataloged every failure, every shortcoming, every evidence of a plan that had collapsed before completion. His voice carried no warmth. Mistress Voss. He did not use her given name. She was not a person in this transaction. She was an entry in a ledger, a line item requiring resolution. We have come to a decision. Mr. Polk shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze fixed on the floor. His fingers tightened on the account book. Your husband's debts to Mr. Polk are considerable, $47.30. The town council has conferred. We cannot allow such liabilities to stand through winter. This cabin, the plot it occupies, will be reclaimed as collateral. Its value, even in this condition, is sufficient to clear the balance. The floor dropped. The air emptied from Elara's lungs as though someone had driven a fist into her solar plexus. The room tilted. She reached for the wall to steady herself, her fingers finding one of the gaps in the chinking, feeling the cold wind on her skin like a mockery. Reclaimed. The word came out broken, half a question, half a statement of disbelief. But where will I go? Winter is nearly the church charity hall. Josiah cut her off with the efficiency of a man accustomed to ending conversations rather than conducting them. His tone suggested he was conferring a gift. Reverend Gideon has been informed. A cot will be made available. You will be warm enough. Others share your circumstances. The charity hall. Elara knew it. A single room at the back of the church, drafty, dim, furnished with a row of narrow cots, separated by hanging blankets, that provided the illusion of privacy without any of its substance. It was where the broken went. The destitute, the infirm, the old men whose bodies had been used up by decades of labor and discarded like worn-out tools. It was a waiting room. People entered the charity hall in autumn. Some emerged in spring. Others did not emerge at all, carried out feet first on a pine board to the cemetery on the hill, where the ground would not thaw enough for proper burial until May. Please. The word tasted like something that had been burned. Just until spring. I can work. I can pay the debt. Laundry, mending, anything. I just need time. Something shifted behind Josiah's eyes. For a fraction of a second, so brief that Elara might have imagined it, a shadow crossed his face. Not pity, something older, more personal. A memory perhaps of another cold room, another impossible situation. But the shadow passed, his jaw set, the granite returned. Time is a luxury Providence Gulch cannot afford this season. Dependence is a contagion, Mistress Voss. This is a place built by hard people making hard decisions. Your husband made his choices. Now you must live with the consequences. He turned toward the door. His pronouncement delivered, he was already moving on to the next item on his mental agenda. He paused at the threshold, his broad back blocking the gray light. You have until the first snow to vacate. After that, we board it up. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes finding hers. That shadow flickered again, longer this time, almost resolving into something recognizable before impatience snuffed it out. It is for the best. A woman alone cannot manage a cabin through a hard winter. It would be a death trap. We are in a way saving you from your own folly. Then he was gone. Mr. Polk followed his ledger clutched tight, his eyes never once meeting Elara's. The door swung inward on its loose hinges, admitting a gust of October wind that scattered the ashes in the stove, rustled the few papers on Caleb's small writing desk, lifted the corner of the bedroll, as though an invisible hand were searching for something beneath it. The wind carried the scent of pine resin, frost-hardened earth, the metallic bite of approaching ice. Folly. The word hung in the air after Josiah's footsteps had faded, after Mr. Polk's thin shadow had disappeared down the path toward town. It hung like smoke in a room with no draft. Folly. A word that contained an entire judgment, an entire philosophy, an entire dismissal of everything she was, everything she might become. Elara stood motionless in the center of the cabin. The cold crept in through the open door, through the gaps in the walls, through the floor itself, rising from the frozen earth beneath the inadequate foundation Caleb had laid. She was not a widow in that moment. She was not a woman, not a person, not even a name. She was a piece of property that had just been foreclosed upon a debt, that had just been called in a problem that had just been solved on someone else's terms. She closed the door. She sat on the bedroll. She did not cry. Tears required a kind of energy she no longer possessed. Instead, she simply sat, her arms wrapped around her knees, her chin resting on her forearms, her eyes fixed on the coal stove, but seeing nothing. The light through the gaps in the walls shifted from gray to a deeper gray as the afternoon surrendered to evening. The temperature dropped. Her breath became visible, small ghosts that formed, lingered, dissolved. That night, she did not sleep. She sat wrapped in every blanket she owned, the wool scratchy against her chin, her body generating a small pocket of warmth that the cabin's drafts constantly eroded. A single tallow candle burned on the crate beside her, its flame dancing in the air currents that threaded through the walls, like the fingers of something trying to find a way in. She watched the flame. It leaned left, then right, then left again, following the invisible choreography of the drafts. It never held still. Nothing in this cabin held still. Everything was in motion, the air, the cold, the creeping damp, the slow disintegration of the chinking, the quiet, relentless entropy of a structure that had been built to impress rather than to endure. Despair was not an emotion. It was a physical presence, a weight distributed across her chest, pressing down on her ribs, compressing her lungs. Each breath required a conscious decision. Inhale, hold, release. Inhale, hold, release, the mechanics of survival reduced to their most fundamental sequence. It was somewhere in the deepest trench of that darkness, in the hours when the candle had burned down to a stub of tallow barely an inch high, that a memory surfaced. Not a dramatic revelation, not a bolt of lightning or a voice from heaven, just a small, quiet image rising through the black water of her exhaustion, like a bubble rising through mud. Her grandmother's hands. Grandmother Marin. That was what Elara had called her as a child. Marin Eric's daughter, though she had been Marin Holt by the time Elara knew her, she had come from the high hollows of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, a place of deep valleys and steep ridges, where winter arrived early, stayed late, pressed down on the scattered settlements, with a weight that the flatland people could not imagine. The Appalachian mountain folk had lived in those hollows for generations. Scots, Irish, German, English. Their bloodlines tangled like the roots of the ancient oaks that held the mountainsides together. They had developed over those generations a relationship with cold that was fundamentally different from the one practiced in Providence Gulch. They did not fight the winter. They negotiated with it. Grandmother Marin had smelled of damp earth, dried herbs, wood smoke embedded so deeply in her clothing that no amount of washing could remove it. Her hands were gnarled, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin roughened by decades of work with stone clay water. But they were always warm. That was the detail Elara remembered most vividly. Even in the coldest months when the hoarfrost turned the windows opaque, Grandmother Marin's hands radiated a gentle, steady heat that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, as though she carried a small furnace in her chest. She had spoken of cold not as an enemy, but as a neighbor. A difficult neighbor, to be sure. One who took liberties, who overstepped boundaries, who could turn lethal if not properly respected. But a neighbor nonetheless, a presence to be understood, accommodated, lived alongside. She had told Elara stories of the old root cellars dug deep into the mountainsides, their interiors maintaining a constant cool temperature in summer, a constant gentle warmth in winter. She had described spring houses built over natural springs, small stone structures where the flowing water kept butter from spoiling in August, kept potatoes from freezing in January. The Earth's own heat, she called it, the warmth that the planet itself provided free of charge to anyone patient enough to listen. Elara rose. Her limbs were stiff, her muscles protesting each movement with a dull, persistent ache. She went to the wooden chest at the foot of her bedroll. It was small, perhaps 2 feet long and 18 inches deep, made of walnut with hand-forged iron hinges that had darkened with age to the color of dried blood. It was the only object she owned that connected her to her mother, who had died of cholera on the Overland Trail when Elara was 11. Before that, it had been Grandmother Marin's. She lifted the lid. The smell that rose from the interior was the smell of another time. Dried lavender-yellowed linen, the faint ghost of cedar shavings that lined the bottom. Beneath a layer of folded fabric, she found it. A notebook, small, perhaps 6 inches by 4, bound in leather, that had been worn smooth by years of handling. The cover was the color of dark honeysuckle, almost soft. A simple leather thong held it shut. Elara had not opened it in years. Her grandmother had tried to teach her from it, to explain the diagrams, the notes, the accumulated wisdom of generations of mountain people who had learned to build with the earth rather than upon it. But Elara had been a child of the plains of the new territories of the westward rush. The old knowledge had seemed quaint, irrelevant, the relic of a world that the railroad was making obsolete. Now her fingers trembling from cold, from exhaustion, from something else she could not name, she untied the leather thong. The pages were filled with Grandmother Marin's handwriting. A small, precise, slightly archaic script, the letters formed with the careful deliberation of a woman who had learned to write late in life, who treated each word as a small act of construction. The ink had faded to a sepia brown, but remained legible. The language was English, plain mountain, English, direct, unadorned, but the penmanship was difficult. The letters crowded close, the lines uneven. Elara could read it, but slowly sounding out words the way she had as a child learning her letters. It was the drawings that stopped her breath. They were not artistic sketches. They were technical diagrams rendered with a draftsman's precision. Each one depicted a structure, but not the kind of structure that Providence Gulch would have recognized. These were low, humble buildings that seemed to emerge from the earth rather than being imposed upon it. Houses built into hillsides, their exposed walls of dry stacked stone, their roofs covered in thick layers of sod, their interiors dug partially below ground level. Root cellars with ventilation systems indicated by careful arrows. Springhouses built over natural water sources, their walls channeling the flow for maximum thermal benefit. She turned the pages with increasing urgency, her numb fingers fumbling at the corners. Page after page. Cross-sections showing how earth bermed against exterior walls created insulation superior to any amount of timber. Diagrams of how a living sod roof, heavy with soil, trapped air between the grass roots, forming a blanket that shed rain in summer, held warmth in winter. Notes on clay mixtures for chinking the specific ratios of clay to water to fiber that produced a seal both flexible enough to resist cracking and the cold dense enough to stop the wind. Then she found it, a drawing that took up 2 full pages, the notebook's spine creaking, as she spread it open on the floor beside the dying candle. It depicted a small circular stone building perhaps 10 feet across, constructed over a natural spring. The level of detail was extraordinary. Arrows indicated the flow of water entering through a fissure in the bedrock at the back of the structure, channeled through a shallow stone-lined trough along the interior wall, then exiting through a low opening at the front. Other arrows showed the movement of air, the way cool outside air would sink into a shallow pit dug near the entrance, while the warmer air heated by contact with the stone walls, tempered by the spring water, would rise gently, filling the upper portion of the space. Notes crowded the margins in Grandmother Marin's cramped hand. Elara deciphered them slowly, her lips moving. Stone remembers warmth. That phrase appeared 3 times, underlined twice. Build with the hill, not on it. The earth's own heat, trust it. Technical observations about the temperature of spring water emerging from depth. How it remained constant through the seasons, cool in summer, warm relative to the frozen surface in winter. Observations about thermal mass, about how dense materials like stone resisted temperature change, absorbing heat, slowly releasing. It's slowly maintaining a stable environment long after the heat source itself had diminished. It was a blueprint for a house that did not fight the cold, a house that enlisted the planet itself as its furnace, a house that did not need to be fed cord after cord of firewood because its heat source was inexhaustible, flowing up from the warm interior of the earth through the ancient fissure of a natural spring. Something displaced the despair, not hope. Hope was too fragile a word for what she felt. This was heavier, denser, more elemental. Resolve. The way bedrock is resolved. The way the root of a tree driven into a crack in granite is resolved. It did not flutter or soar. It settled. It locked into place with an almost audible click, like a bolt sliding home. She remembered. On the far northeastern edge of the town's chartered land, beyond the last fenced pasture up a rocky slope, too steep for a plow, too sparse for valuable timber, there was a piece of ground that no one wanted. It was considered worthless, a jumble of exposed rock, scrub, oak, tangled brush. At the base of the slope, nestled among a stand of gnarled bur oaks, whose trunks were as thick as a man's waist, stood an old springhouse. It had been built by the territory's first settlers decades ago, used briefly, then abandoned when the town consolidated around the mill site a half-mile south. A pile of rocks, people called it. A ruin. A landmark for hunters heading up the ridge, nothing more. The spring, though, Elara had seen it once 2 summers ago when she walked the perimeter of the town's land looking for berry bushes. The water flowed clear from a crack in the bedrock, steady, unhurried, the kind of flow that did not vary with the seasons, because it came from a depth where seasons did not exist. She had knelt beside it, then cupped water in her hands, drunk. It had been cool, not cold, not the teeth-aching iciness of snow melt. Cool, the temperature of the deep earth. She had noticed it without understanding it. Now, reading her grandmother's diagrams in the guttering light of a dying candle, she understood. She began before dawn. She packed the wooden chest first, the notebook inside it wrapped in the driest cloth she could find. Then the essentials. Her cast iron pot, small enough to carry but large enough to cook a meal. Her knife, a sturdy blade with a wooden handle that Caleb had sharpened to a razor edge the week before he died. Her blankets, both of them rolled tight, the small shovel with the cracked handle that Caleb had used to dig the cabin's foundation. Her few clothes, a second wool dress, an extra pair of stockings darned so many times they were more thread than original fabric, a heavy shawl that had been Grandmother Marin's. She loaded everything onto the handcart Caleb had built from scrap lumber, a crude platform on 2 uneven wheels that squeaked with every rotation. The cabin watched her pack with its gap-toothed walls, its slumping roofline, its air of cheerful incompletion. She felt nothing for it. It had never been hers. It had been Caleb's dream, a dream built on credit optimism, the specific delusion of a young man who believed the future would be kinder than the past. The dream was dead. The dreamer was dead. The structure that housed the dream was already dying. Its mud chinking, flaking away, its timbers beginning the long, slow process of returning to the earth from which they had been taken. She did not say goodbye to anyone. She pulled the handcart through the cabin door, wedged a plank against the frame to hold it shut, walked down the 3 uneven steps Caleb had built, from flat stones turned left onto the track that led north out of the gulch. The wheels squeaked. The load shifted with each rut, each stone requiring constant small corrections that sent jolts up her arms into her shoulders. She passed Mr. Polk's provisioner store. Through the front window, she saw him standing behind his counter, his ledger open before him, his pen poised over a column of figures. He looked up as she passed. Their eyes met through the wavering glass. His expression was unreadable. Not guilt, not satisfaction, not pity. Something closer to the look of a man watching a ship leave harbor for open water, as knowing the seas are rough, knowing the vessel is not seaworthy, feeling the pull of responsibility without the will to act upon it. He looked back down at his ledger. Elara looked away. At the corner where the north track branched off from the main street, Ada Fairfield stood. She was wrapped in a gray wool coat that had been let out at the seams so many times it no longer had a coherent shape, just a vague approximation of warmth draped over her thin frame. Her white hair was pulled back under a bonnet that had once been blue. She was 62 years old, a widow for 9 years, surviving on a garden, a few chickens, the quiet charity of neighbors, who remembered her late husband's carpentry work with enough fondness to occasionally leave provisions on her porch. She did not speak. She did not try to stop Elara. She did not offer advice or shelter or the kind of pitying consolation that Elara had come to dread more than the cold itself. She simply stood at the corner, her hands folded at her waist, her eyes steady, her chin lifted. As Elara drew level, the handcart squeaking and lurching over the frozen ruts, Ada gave a single small nod. Not a gesture of farewell, not a benediction, something more private, an acknowledgement perhaps. One woman who had been reduced to a problem recognizing another who was refusing to be solved. Elara returned the nod. She did not slow her pace. The handcart's wheels found a stretch of smoother ground. The squeaking eased. The track curved north, climbing gradually through a stand of bare aspens whose white trunks stood like pillars in a ruined cathedral. Behind her, the sounds of Providence Gulch, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the shout of a teamster. The distant thud of an axe grew fainter, then faded altogether, replaced by the sound of wind moving through the bare branches. A dry, papery whisper like the turning of pages in an old book. The gray hills rose ahead of her, their slopes mottled with patches of dark timber, exposed rock the color of old iron. The sky pressed down. The wind found the gaps in her shawl, her collar the space between her cuffs. She leaned into the grade, her boots finding purchase on the frozen ground, her breath coming in short white bursts that the wind shredded before they could fully form. She was walking toward a pile of rocks that no one wanted on a hillside, that no one valued, carrying the notebook of a dead woman whose knowledge the world had discarded as obsolete. She had no money, no allies, no skills in construction, no guarantee that the diagrams in the notebook would translate from Mountain Hollow wisdom to Dakota Territory survival. She had a knife, a shovel, a pot, 2 blankets, a handcart with a squeaky wheel. She had 6 weeks, perhaps 7, before the snow closed in for good. She had the memory of her grandmother's hands always warm. She had resolve. The track steepened. The aspens gave way to scrub oak, then to exposed rock. The handcart protested. She pulled harder. The wheel struck a stone, jolted, nearly tipped. She steadied it, adjusted the load, pulled again. The wind pushed against her. She pushed back. The hills rose. She climbed. Behind her in Providence, Gulch smoke rose from 24 chimneys, straight columns of gray dissolving into the gray sky. The iron stoves were burning. The firewood was disappearing. The men were confident. The women were calculating. The winter was coiling. Ahead of her, invisible beyond the next ridge, a spring flowed from a crack in the ancient bedrock, its water rising from a place so deep that the concept of seasons had no meaning there. It had been flowing since before the town existed, before the territory was mapped, before the first human eye looked upon this particular fold of the Black Hills. It would flow long after every cabin in the gulch had rotted back into the soil, long after every iron stove had rusted to a pile of orange flakes, long after the names of Josiah, Hargrave, Elara Voss, Providence Gulch itself had been forgotten. The earth's own heat, patient, constant, waiting. Elara climbed toward it. The springhouse was worse than memory had promised. Memory, Elara was learning, had a way of softening edges, of rounding off the sharp corners of reality into something the mind could carry without cutting itself. She had remembered a small stone structure, quaint in its abandonment, picturesque in the way that ruins sometimes are when viewed from a safe distance on a summer afternoon. What she found after dragging the handcart up the final 100 yards of rocky slope, her boots sliding on loose scree, her shoulders burning from the effort, was not picturesque. It was a wound in the hillside. The walls still stood on 3 sides, dry stacked fieldstone rising to perhaps 6 feet at their highest point, but the 4th wall, the one facing south, had partially collapsed. Stones lay scattered down the slope like teeth knocked from a jaw. The roof was gone entirely on the eastern half, old timber rafters having rotted through at their bearing points, dropping into the interior, where they lay in a tangle of decomposing wood. Dead vines, bird nests constructed from mud feathers, scraps of bark. The western half of the roof clung on through stubbornness alone, its remaining rafters bowed under the weight of accumulated debris, sagging so deeply that the center point nearly touched the floor. The interior was a compost heap. Layers of fallen leaves compacted by years of rain, snow, the slow, patient work of decomposition filled the space to a depth of nearly 2 feet. The smell was rich, complex, not unpleasant, but overwhelming. Damp earth, rotting wood, the sharp ammoniac tang of animal droppings, something fungal, something vegetal, something ancient, But the spring was alive. It emerged from a fissure in the exposed bedrock at the rear of the structure, a crack no wider than 2 fingers from which water flowed with a steady, unhurried persistence that suggested it had been doing exactly this for longer than human memory could reach. The water was clear, not the sparkling clarity of a mountain stream tumbling over rocks, catching light, performing for an audience. This was a deeper clarity, a stillness within the movement, the transparency of something that had been filtered through hundreds of feet of stone, stripped of every impurity, arriving at the surface as pure as the rain that had entered the ground decades or centuries before. It pooled briefly in a shallow natural basin, worn into the bedrock, then overflowed, trickling across the flagstone floor, through channels it had carved for itself over the years, finding the gaps in the collapsed south wall, disappearing into the scrub outside. Elara set down the handcart. She knelt beside the basin. She cupped in water in both hands, brought it to her lips, cool, the same temperature she remembered from 2 summers ago, 50 degrees, perhaps 52. In July, that had felt refreshing. Now in October, with the air temperature dropping toward freezing each night, it felt like something else entirely. It felt warm, not hot, not comfortable, not the embrace of a heated room, but warm relative to the world outside, warm relative to the wind that was even now finding its way through the gaps in the ruined walls, warm relative to everything she had known for the past 6 months. The water carried the temperature of depth of permanence of the planet's interior, where seasons were an abstraction that never penetrated. She pressed her wet hands against her cheeks. The moisture was cool on her skin, but the stone beneath her knees radiated something subtler, a neutrality that was neither warm nor cold, but simply constant. She understood then, not with her mind, but with her body, what her grandmother's notebook had been trying to tell her. The earth was not empty beneath her feet. It was full, full of heat stored from a million summers, full of the slow radioactive warmth of the planet's core, full of a patience that made human lifespans look like the flicker of a struck match. This was her stove. This was her furnace. This crack in the bedrock, this modest trickle of 50-degree water was worth more than every cast iron monument in every cabin in Providence Gulch. The first 3 days were demolition. She pulled the collapsed rafters from the interior, dragging each one outside, sorting them into 2 piles, those still sound enough to reuse those too far gone to trust. The soundwood she stacked against the north wall. The rotted pieces she broke into lengths for kindling, a small fire being necessary for cooking, even if it would not be her primary heat source. She cleared the leaf litter with her hands, scooping armfuls of the damp, compressed mass, carrying it outside, dumping it in a growing mound that steamed faintly in the morning cold. Beneath the litter, she found the original flagstone floor, large flat stones fitted together with a craftsman's care, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of water flow. They were beautiful in their plainness, each one a slightly different shade of gray, fitted together like the pieces of a puzzle whose solution was a floor. She slept outside those first nights, her bedroll pressed against the exterior of the north wall, where the stone offered a margin of wind protection. The cold woke her every few hours, a sharp intrusion that dragged her from the shallow, exhausted sleep of physical labor into the full awareness of her situation. Stars above, wind in the oaks, the distant yip of coyotes working the creek bottom below. Her muscles screamed each morning, her back locked in a spasm that took 20 minutes of slow, painful stretching to release. On the 4th morning, she woke to find that her fire pit had been disturbed. The ashes were scattered in a pattern too deliberate for wind. A ring of small stones had been placed around the pit's perimeter, containing the ash, improving the draft. Beside the pit, laid on a flat rock with an almost ceremonial precision, were 2 brook trout. Their scales still held a faint iridescence. Their gills were bright red. They had been caught within the hour. She scanned the tree line. The oaks stood silent, their bare branches interlocking overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral designed by a mad architect. Nothing moved. She looked down at the fish at the stone ring, at the care with which both had been placed. Someone was watching. Someone who understood fire, Who knew fish who moved through the woods without leaving visible tracks? She took the fish, she cleaned them with her knife, roasted them over the improved fire pit, ate slowly, savoring the protein her body had been craving for weeks. She left half a biscuit on the flat rock, the last of a small supply she had brought from the cabin. The next morning, the biscuit was gone. In its place, a bundle of dried grass twisted into a tight rope, the kind used for snare lines. Beside it, 3 pine cones filled with pitch natural fire starters that burned hot for several minutes. The exchange had been established, not through words, not through any visible contact, but through the oldest language available to 2 creatures sharing a territory. Offering, acceptance, reciprocity. On the 6th day she saw him, she was hauling stones from the collapsed south wall back into position, her arms trembling under the weight of a field stone the size of a bread loaf, when a movement at the edge of the oak grove caught her eye. A figure, small, lean, standing motionless in the dappled shadow between 2 trunks. A boy, perhaps 14, though his frame was so spare that he might have been younger. His skin was brown, his hair black, cut unevenly at the jawline. He wore a combination of garments that suggested no single origin, a wool shirt too large for him, cinched at the waist with a leather belt, canvas trousers patched at both knees. Moccasins that were clearly his own work, the stitching tight, the leather supple. His eyes were dark, watchful, holding the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being looked at without being seen. Elara set down the stone. She straightened, pressing her hands against the small of her back. She looked at the boy. He looked at her. Neither spoke. The wind moved through the bare oaks, producing a sound like dry fingers rubbing together. A crow called from somewhere up the ridge, a single harsh syllable. She pointed to the fire pit, to the stone ring, to the flat rock where the exchanges had been made. Then she pointed to the trout roasting on a green stick over the coals, 2 more of them delivered that morning before dawn. She made a gesture with both hands, palms up, an invitation that transcended the need for shared vocabulary. The boy did not move for a long moment. His eyes traveled from her face to the spring house, to the scattered tools, to the notebook lying open on a rock beside the spring, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Something in that survey, some calculation of risk, weight against need, resolved in her favor. He stepped out of the shadow, crossed the clearing with a walk that made no sound on the rocky ground, sat down beside the fire. He ate. She ate. The fire crackled between them. His name, she would learn later, through a combination of gestures, scratched dirt drawings, a handful of English words deployed with careful precision, was Tokala. It was a Lakota name meaning fox, given for the way he moved through the woods, quick, silent, present, then gone. He was an orphan. His parents had died in the winter of 1884. His father of tuberculosis, his mother of the grief that followed a wasting that the reservation doctors had no name for because their medicine did not recognize the body's capacity to simply surrender. He had been taken in by a series of relatives, each arrangement more temporary than the last, until he had slipped away from the reservation, entirely living in the margins between the white settlements, neither belonging to his own people's diminished world, nor accepted into the one that had replaced it. He survived by knowing things, where the trout held in cold water, where the rabbits ran, which roots were edible, which were poison, which could be traded to white women who believed in their medicinal properties. He had been watching the Springhouse for 3 days before making contact. He knew the spring. His grandfather had told him that this hillside was a place his people had used for generations before the white settlers arrived at winter camp, chosen for the constant flow of warm water from the rock. The old Springhouse had been built on the foundation of something older, a Lakota shelter, whose stones had been repurposed by settlers who never wondered why someone had stacked them there in the first place. Tokala did not offer this history immediately. It came out in fragments over the following weeks, pieces of a mosaic assembled slowly through shared labor. Shared meals, the gradual erosion of mutual wariness into something that resembled, if not trust, then at least the recognition that survival was easier divided by 2. The real work began the following morning. Elara spread the notebook open on its rock, anchoring the pages with small stones against the wind. She traced the diagrams with her finger, while Tokala watched his dark eyes following the lines, the arrows, the annotations. He could not read the cramped English script, but he understood the drawings immediately with an intuition that startled her. When she pointed to the diagram showing a trench dug below the frost line around the exterior walls, he nodded once, picked up the shovel. Before she could reach for it, walked to the north wall, drove the blade into the earth with a force that buried it to the hilt. The trench consumed 8 days. Not the weeks she had estimated, because the ground fought them. The topsoil yielded easily enough a thin layer of rocky dirt laced with oak roots that required chopping before the shovel could pass. But below that, at a depth of about 18 inches, they hit a stratum of compacted clay mixed with gravel that resisted the shovel blade the way bone resists a dull knife. They took turns. Elara dug while Tokala hauled the excavated earth in a canvas sack, depositing it in a growing pile that would later become the berm. Then Tokala dug while Elara hauled. The rhythm established itself without discussion. Dig, lift, haul, dump, return, repeat. 4 feet down below the frost line, the earth changed again. It became softer, darker, warmer to the touch. This was the temperature that did not vary the constant 50-something degrees that her grandmother's notebook described. Elara pressed her palm flat against the exposed soil at the bottom of the trench. It was cool but not cold. It held the same neutral warmth as the spring water. She was touching the thermal mass of the planet, the vast reservoir of heat that the surface world, with its dramatic seasons, its blizzards, its killing frosts, could never fully penetrate. While they dug, they ate. This was the rhythm Elara imposed on each day with deliberate discipline, understanding that the body performing hard labor was a furnace that required fuel as surely as any iron stove. Tokala had shown her where to set snare lines along the rabbit runs that crisscrossed the hillside, simple loops of twisted grass, cord positioned at gaps in the brush, where the animals funneled through. Most mornings yielded at least 1 rabbit, sometimes 2. She skinned them with her knife, saved the hides for later use, roasted the meat over the fire pit, or boiled it with wild onions into a broth that restored warmth from the inside. The brook below the spring house held trout that Tokala caught with a patience she envied, standing motionless in the shallows, his hands submerged, waiting for a fish to drift within reach, before closing his fingers with a speed that seemed to bypass the normal sequence of perception, decision, action. She smoked the surplus over a rack of green sticks, producing strips of dried fish that she stored in a cloth sack hung from a rafter out of reach of mice. She gathered the last of the season's wild plums from a thicket on the south-facing slope, mashing them into a paste that she dried on flat rocks in the thin October sun. Late-season rose hips, hard, bright red, sour enough to make her jaw ache. She collected by the handful, knowing they contained something that prevented the bleeding gums of winter scurvy, a piece of knowledge so old she could not remember whether it came from her grandmother or from some other source entirely. Once a week, she walked the 3 miles to Ada Fairfield's cabin at the edge of town. She carried a pouch of dried herbs, yarrow mint, the last of the wild chamomile items she knew Ada valued for her Tysonese. In exchange, Ada provided small quantities of flour salt, a precious jar of apple butter that Elara rationed as though it were gold. These visits were brief, practical. Ada never asked questions about the spring house. Elara never volunteered information. Their exchanges had the quality of transactions conducted between members of a resistance movement, quick-coded, deniable. With the trench complete, chinking began. Elara had identified the clay deposit during the digging, a rich gray vein exposed along the creek bank below the spring house beneath the roots of a fallen cottonwood. She excavated it with her hands, pulling fistfuls of the dense, sticky material from the bank, loading it into the canvas sack, hauling it uphill. Each load weighed perhaps 30 pounds. The distance was 200 yards, most of it uphill. She made the trip 8 to 12 times a day. She mixed the clay in a shallow pit she had dug beside the spring house, adding water from the spring, working the mixture with her bare feet. The cold was immediate, a sharp pain that traveled from the soles of her feet up through her ankles, her shins settling deep in the marrow of her leg bones. But Grandmother Marin's notebook was specific on this point. The clay had to be felt with the skin to judge its consistency. Too dry, it would crack. Too wet, it would slump. The right consistency was a texture that yielded it under pressure, but held its shape when released like the flesh of a ripe fruit. She added the binder. Tokala gathered dried grass from the hillside, cutting it into short lengths, with a knife producing bundles that he stacked beside the mixing pit. For additional strength, Elara took her knife, gathered her hair still long enough to reach her shoulder blade, despite weeks of neglect, pulled it taut. She cut. The blade was sharp, the hair separated cleanly, falling into her lap in thick brown hanks. She worked them into the clay mixture, distributing the fibers evenly. Tokala watched this without expression. He had seen sacrifice take many forms. Hair was among the least costly. Application consumed 2 full weeks. Working from the inside first, Elara forced the clay mixture into every gap between the stones, pressing it deep with her fingers, smoothing the surface, building up layers where the gaps were wide. Her fingertips went white, then numb, then began to crack the skin, splitting along lines that mirrored the fissures in the stone. She wrapped them in strips torn from her spare stockings, kept working. The pain became architectural, a permanent feature of her daily existence. Load-bearing, structural, impossible to remove without bringing down the whole enterprise. The transformation was visible, tangible. The loose aggregation of fieldstone, which had leaked wind through 100 apertures, was becoming a solid wall, a monolith. The clay filled every void, sealed every crack, bonded stone to stone, with a grip that would only strengthen as it dried. Tokala worked the exterior, his smaller hands finding gaps that Elara's could not reach, his patience for the repetitive work seemingly inexhaustible. By the end of the second week, the walls were sealed. Elara lit a candle inside the structure for the first time. The flame stood upright, perfectly still. The wind, which had been a constant invasive presence since the day she arrived, was gone. She pressed her palm against the interior wall. The stone was cool but not cold. The clay between the stones was slightly warmer, still holding the residual heat from the mixing from her hands from the friction of application. The wall had become a single continuous surface, a shell. Her shell. The roof was next. The collapsed eastern section gaped open to the sky, admitting rain, wind, the occasional visitation of a confused owl that had been roosting in the ruins long before Elara's arrival. She scavenged fallen timber from the surrounding woods, selecting trunks no thicker than 6 inches, light enough to lift with effort, but strong enough to span the 10-foot gap. Tokala proved invaluable here. He had a natural understanding of leverage that seemed instinctive, knowing without being told where to place a fulcrum stone, how to angle a pole to multiply the force applied to a log too heavy to lift directly. Together, they rolled the new rafters into position, notching their ends to sit securely on the stone walls. On top of the rafters, they laid a dense mat of smaller branches, pine boughs, strips of bark, creating a thatch layer that blocked direct water penetration. Then came the sod. Elara cut thick squares of turf from the hillside, each one roughly 18 inches across, heavy with soil, root-dormant grass. She loaded them onto a makeshift ramp of planked logs, hauled them up one at a time, laid them across the thatch in overlapping rows like shingles. 1 layer, 2 layers, 3. The weight was immense. The new rafters groaned. Elara lay awake the first night after completing the sod roof, listening to the structure above her, reading its sounds the way a sailor reads the sounds of a ship's hull, creaking, settling, adjusting to the new load, but holding. The rafters held. One afternoon during the 4th week, a near disaster. Elara was on the roof positioning a final row of sod along the ridgeline when one of the planks in the ramp shifted beneath her foot. She pitched forward, her center of gravity carrying her over the edge. For a fraction of a second she was falling, her arms reaching for purchase that wasn't there, her stomach dropping, her mind registering the scattered rocks below, with the detached clarity of someone observing an event that has already concluded. Then a hand closed around her wrist. Tokala, standing on the ramp below her, had lunged upward with a speed that his slight frame seemed incapable of producing. His grip was astonishingly strong, his fingers locking around her wrist with a force that would leave bruises for a week. He hauled her back onto the ramp. They both sat there breathing hard, the near miss settling into their bodies as a tremor that took several minutes to subside. Neither spoke. Tokala released her wrist, examined it briefly to confirm nothing was broken, then picked up the next square of sod. The work continued, but something had shifted between them. The transactional quality of their partnership, the careful exchange of labor for labor, food for food, had been replaced by something that had no equivalent in the language of commerce. With the roof complete, Elara turned to the berm. This was the most physically demanding phase, the one she had dreaded since reading her grandmother's diagram. The earth excavated from the trench, augmented by additional soil scraped from the hillside, had to be piled against the north wall to a height that reached the eaves. She was pulling the earth up like a blanket, tucking the house into the hillside, creating a barrier of packed soil between the stone walls and the prevailing winter wind. It was shovel work, wheelbarrow work, but she had no wheelbarrow. She had a canvas sack, a pair of arms that had grown wiry from weeks of labor, a boy who could carry half his own weight in dirt without complaint. They worked from dawn until the light failed, loading, hauling, dumping, spreading, packing. The mound grew by inches. Inches became feet. Feet became a slope. By the end of the 5th week, the north wall had disappeared entirely behind a gentle earthen ramp that merged with the natural contour of the hillside. From a distance, the Springhouse no longer looked like a building. It looked like a geological feature, a low mound, a natural swelling of the terrain. Inside, she turned her attention to the spring. This was the heart of the system, the component that made everything else possible. Using flat stones selected for their uniform thickness, she constructed a shallow channel, no wider than her hand, no deeper than 2 inches, that intercepted a portion of the spring's flow at the point where it emerged from the bedrock. The channel guided the water along the base of the interior back wall, running the full length of the structure before rejoining the main flow near the entrance. This was her radiator. The water emerging at its constant temperature would release thermal energy into the stone wall as it flowed, warming the surface by a few degrees above the ambient temperature. Not enough to feel hot, enough to feel alive. Near the doorway, she dug a shallow pit 2 feet deep, roughly 3 feet across. Her grandmother's notebook called it a cold sink, though Grandmother Marin had written the term in quotation marks, suggesting she was translating from a concept rather than coining a phrase. The physics were elegant in their simplicity, cold air being denser than warm air falls. Any frigid air entering through the door would drop into this pit, trapped by its own weight, unable to rise and contaminate the warmer air in the living space above. A moat against the cold dug into the floor itself. The door was her final task. The original had decomposed years ago, leaving only the rusted remnants of its iron hinges embedded in the stone. She built a new one from salvaged planks, 3 thick boards held together by cross pieces pegged with wooden dowels, Tokala whittled from oak. For insulation, she packed the interior face with a layer of dried moss, then stretched rabbit hides over it, the accumulated pelts from 6 weeks of snaring. The result was ugly, uneven, the kind of door that Josiah Hargrave would have looked upon with the contempt he reserved for work that failed to meet his standards. But it was thick, dense, nearly airtight when pulled shut against the stone frame she had chiseled to receive it. She hung a heavy blanket on the inside for additional protection. Through all of this, the town continued its parallel existence below. Every few days, Elara would catch glimpses of the wider world during her trips to Ada's cabin or her expeditions for clay. Logging parties passed on the track below the Springhouse, groups of men heading toward the high country in search of the diminishing firewood that the town's survival depended upon. Early in her construction, these encounters produced mockery. A group of 4 loggers stopped to watch her shoveling earth against the north wall, their axes over their shoulders, their faces expressing the particular amusement of men observing behavior they consider both incomprehensible and beneath their concern. One of them, a heavy-set man with a red beard, cupped his hands around his mouth. "The widow's digging herself a grave. Saves us the trouble come spring." Laughter, crude but genuine, the laughter of men for whom death was a daily occupational hazard, whose humor had been stripped of nuance by the proximity of real danger. She did not look up. She did not pause. She drove the shovel into the earth, lifted, turned, dumped. The loggers watched for another minute, grew bored, moved on. Josiah Hargrave appeared on horseback 2 weeks into the construction, riding his big gray gelding up the track toward the high timber. He reined in at the point where the track curved closest to the Springhouse, perhaps 40 yards distant. From his elevated vantage, he could see the full scope of what Elara was attempting. The trench, the clay-sealed walls, the growing berm, the sod roof already beginning to blend with the hillside. She was in the trench, waist-deep, her dress filthy, her hair cropped short, her face streaked with clay. She felt his gaze before she saw him, a physical sensation, the weight of judgment projected across the distance between them. She climbed out of the trench, stood on the lip, met his eyes. His expression was complex. Contempt was present, the professional disdain of a master craftsman observing an amateur's work. But beneath it, something else flickered. Recognition, perhaps. The involuntary acknowledgement of effort regardless of its direction. The same way a general might regard an enemy fortification, disapproving of its existence while grudgingly noting the labor required to build it. His voice carried easily in the still air the deep baritone that the town had learned to treat as the voice of authority itself. "Woman's folly. That stone will draw the cold in like a magnet. You'll be a block of ice before the new year. I warned you." He did not wait for a response. He spurred the gelding, continued up the track, his broad back receding into the gray distance. The words hung in the air for a moment, then the wind took them, scattered them across the hillside where they fell among the stones like seeds planted in barren ground. A block of ice. Elara turned the phrase over in her mind. It lodged there not as a wound but as a whetstone. She felt her anger sharpen against it, honing itself to a fine functional edge. He was wrong. She knew he was wrong with a certainty that went beyond the diagrams in her grandmother's notebook, beyond the theoretical principles of thermal mass, beyond anything she could articulate in the language of builders. She knew it with her hands, which had felt the constant warmth of the deep earth at the bottom of the trench. She knew it with her feet, which had stood in the spring water and felt the temperature of a world beneath the world. She knew it the way her grandmother had known it, with the accumulated physical wisdom of women who had been building shelters since before the concept of architecture existed. Stone does not draw the cold. Stone remembers warmth. A week before the construction was finished, a different visitor appeared. Jed Sutter was 25, a logger, broad-shouldered, sandy-haired, with the weathered face of a man who spent his days in wind-rain, biting cold. He had been among the group that had shouted the grave-digging joke. Elara recognized him by his red wool cap, the only spot of color in the gray palette of the autumn landscape. He came alone on foot in the blue-gray hour of early evening when the light was failing. He did not approach directly. He stood at the edge of the oak grove for several minutes watching. Elara was inside the spring house working on the water channel, her back to the door. Tokala saw him first. The boy went still, his hands pausing over the stone he was positioning, his eyes tracking the figure at the tree line with the unblinking focus of his namesake animal. Sutter walked closer. He stopped at the open doorway, ducked his head to peer inside. His eyes moved over the sealed walls, the sod roof, the water channel, the cold sink pit. He saw the notebook open on its rock, the diagrams visible. He studied it for a long moment. Elara had turned to face him. Their eyes met. He said nothing. He straightened, stepped back, turned, walked down the hill. His footsteps crunched on the frozen ground, fading into the evening silence. The next morning, a bundle of dry split firewood leaned against the springhouse door. Good wood seasoned pine, cut to stove lengths. Enough for a week of cooking fires. No note, no sign of the person who had left it. Elara carried the wood inside. She stacked it neatly beside the fire pit. She looked at Tokala. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth, usually set in a line of practiced neutrality, twitched. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one. Meanwhile, in Providence Gulch, the arithmetic of survival was turning hostile. The communal woodpile had been measured by Josiah himself on the 1st of November, a ritual he performed each year with the solemnity of a priest conducting an inventory of sacred relics. The measurement confirmed what the quiet anxiety of the previous weeks had whispered. The pile was 30% smaller than the same date the prior year. The early freezes that had cut short the logging season, combined with the increased consumption driven by the unseasonable cold of late September, had created a deficit that no amount of rationing could fully address. Josiah convened the town council in the church. The meeting was tense, the room cold despite the stove burning at full capacity, the men's breath visible as they argued over allocation quotas, emergency logging expeditions, the possibility of purchasing cordwood from the settlement at Deadwood, 40 miles distant over roads that might already be impassable. Martha Hargrave attended, sitting in the back pew as she always did during council meetings, her role unofficial but acknowledged. She was 51, a woman whose face bore the particular beauty of endurance, the lines around her eyes recording not years, but events survived. She had not spoken of Thomas in a decade. She carried the loss the way she carried everything internally, its weight distributed across a frame that had learned to bear loads that would have broken a less practiced architecture. She watched her husband command the room, his voice filling the church the way it filled every space he entered. She noted the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands when he pointed to figures on a chalkboard. She recognized these signs. She had seen them once before, 12 years ago, in the days before the cold took their son. Outside the church, the first flakes of the season drifted down through the still air. They were small, delicate, the kind the old-timers call scout snow, the advance guard of something larger. They melted on contact with the ground, leaving dark spots on the frozen earth that evaporated within seconds. Temporary, a rehearsal. The main performance was still waiting in the wings. Back at the Springhouse, Elara was finishing the door. She worked by the light of her last candle stub, fitting the planks together, pegging the cross pieces, packing the moss insulation into the gaps. Tokala sat by the fire outside, feeding it small sticks, watching the sky. He had been quiet all day, quieter than usual, his movements carrying a tension that Elara had come to read as clearly as printed text. Something was bothering him, something he lacked the English words to express. She hung the door. She tested it, pulling it open, pulling it closed. It scraped against the stone frame but seated firmly. She hung the blanket over the interior face. She stepped back. The Springhouse was complete. 6 weeks of labor. 42 days of digging, hauling, mixing, sealing, lifting, fitting, cutting, packing. 42 days of rabbit stew, smoked trout, rose hip tea, the occasional luxury of a biscuit made with the Ada Fairfield's flour. 42 days of sleeping on stone, waking to pain, working through pain, sleeping again. Her body had been remade by the work. She was leaner, harder, her arms roped with muscle that had not existed 2 months ago. Her hands were calloused, the cracks healed over with tough new skin that could grip rough stone without flinching. She moved differently now, with an economy of motion that comes from weeks of hard physical labor. Every gesture purposeful, no energy wasted. She lit a candle inside the sealed Springhouse, placed it on the small wooden crate that served as her table, stepped back, watched. The flame stood perfectly upright, a golden teardrop motionless, as steady as if it had been painted on the air. The wind that had been her constant companion for 6 weeks, the invisible antagonist that found every gap, every flaw, every moment of inattention, was sealed out. The only sound was the spring's water moving through the stone channel along the back wall with a soft, continuous murmur, a vibration in the stone floor, a rhythm that the body could attune itself to, the way a sleeping child attunes to a mother's heartbeat. The air inside was cool, humid still. It smelled of damp stone clay, the faint green scent of the moss insulation, the mineral tang of the spring water. The temperature held at perhaps 55 degrees, marginally warmer than the water itself, boosted by the thermal mass of the sealed stone walls retaining the day's accumulated solar heat. On the south-facing surface, by the body heat of two people occupying a small enclosed space by the small cooking fire, whose smoke exited through a narrow gap she had left at the roof's ridgeline. Not comfortable by the standards of a cabin with a roaring stove, but not cold, not dangerous, not the enemy. It was the temperature at which food stayed fresh, at which water remained liquid, at which a human body wrapped in wool blankets could sleep through the night without waking to find frost on the walls. Elara sat on her bedroll, her back against the stone wall. The stone pressed through the wool of her dress, cool but not hostile. It had a quality she could only describe as patience. It was not trying to warm her. It was not trying to cool her. It was simply maintaining its own temperature, the temperature of the deep earth, the temperature of permanence. She was inside the hill. The wind could scream all night. The temperature could plunge to numbers that burst thermometers. It did not matter. She was below the frost line, behind walls that held the memory of warmth, beside a spring that drew its heat from the core of the world. Tokala came inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The blankets settled over the frame. He sat cross-legged near the fire pit now, just a bed of coals from the evening's cooking, its warmth a gentle supplement to the ambient temperature. He looked around the space with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it because it was so unfamiliar in his repertoire. Contentment, the specific physical contentment of a creature that has found shelter. He lay down on his bedroll. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the slow, regular rhythm of sleep. Elara watched him. This boy who owned nothing, who belonged nowhere, who existed in the margin between two worlds, neither of which claimed him. He was sleeping the way a child sleeps in a safe place, deeply, completely, his body's vigilance finally standing down. She was still watching the candle when Tokala stirred. Not from sleep, but from something deeper, some current of unease that surfaced through the layers of exhaustion. He sat up. His eyes had emptied to the dark, caught the candlelight, reflecting it back like the eyes of a night animal. He moved to the door, opened it a crack, looked out. The sky was visible through the narrow gap, a strip of black dense with stars. The wind had dropped. The silence was total. He closed the door. He turned to Elara. His face held an expression she had not seen before, a tightness around the eyes, a tension in the jaw. He spoke in Lakota, a rapid sequence of syllables that she could not parse. He stopped, frustrated by the wall of language. He tried again, this time in English, selecting each word with the care of a man handling something fragile. Waniyetu. He pointed north. Big cold. My grandfather speaks of this, the cold that eats. His eyes held hers. The candlelight between them wavered for the first time, not from a draft, but from the tremor running through the floor, a vibration so faint it might have been imagined transmitted through the bedrock from some disturbance far to the north. A pressure change, a shift in the atmosphere, so massive that the earth itself registered it. Elara looked at the steady flame. She looked at the boy whose grandfather remembered winters that preceded memory. She looked at the stone walls, the earthen roof, the flowing water. Let it come, her voice barely above the murmur of the spring. We are inside the earth. Let it come. The flame burned on. The water flowed. Outside, the stars disappeared behind a curtain of cloud that moved from the north with the slow, deliberate certainty of something that had been traveling a very long distance to arrive at this exact place at this exact moment. The temperature dropped 3 degrees in 20 minutes, then 5 more. The cloud thickened. The first flakes fell, not the delicate scout snow of a week ago, but something heavier, denser, falling with purpose. In Providence Gulch, the iron stoves roared. The firewood shrank. Josiah Hargrave sat beside his wife's bed, feeding kindling into the mouth of progress, feeling the draft on the back of his neck where the chinking had cracked, listening to Martha cough. The proud roof lines of his cabins cut sharp angles against the darkening sky, monuments to a philosophy that was about to be tested by a force that did not recognize the authority of monuments. The winter was no longer coiling. It was arriving. The storm did not arrive. It invaded. It came from the north with the deliberate, unhurried malice of an army that knows the ground it is crossing cannot be defended. A wall of white that consumed the horizon the way a tide consumes a beach, completely inevitably without negotiation. The old-timers would name it afterward as people name hurricanes, giving it a human identity to contain its inhuman scale. They called it the widow's veil, for the blinding white sheets that erased the world, that made every direction identical, that reduced the act of walking 10 feet from your own front door into a gamble with death. It struck at 4 in the morning on December 12th. The barometric pressure had been falling for 2 days, a descent so steep that the mercury columns in the town's instruments dropped visibly between readings, the fluid retreating down the glass tubes like something trying to hide. The temperature followed. 30 degrees at midnight, 20 at 1, 10 at 2, 0 at 3. And at 4 when the wind arrived, the mercury passed below the lowest mark on the Gulch's official thermometer, the instrument mounted on a post in front of Josiah Hargrave's office, a handsome brass device imported from Philadelphia. By dawn, the column had contracted to a frozen silver bead at the bottom of the tube. The glass cracked. The thermometer, that symbol of rational measurement of humanity's ability to quantify the natural world, surrendered to a force that exceeded its capacity to record. The wind was not wind in any conventional sense. It was a horizontal river of ice crystals moving at 60 miles per hour, a scouring blast that stripped at exposed skin in seconds, that drove snow not downward but sideways with such velocity that the flakes became projectiles, tiny frozen missiles that stung like thrown sand. Visibility dropped to 0. A man standing on his own porch could not see the ground beneath his feet. The world had become a white void, featureless, directionless, lethal. In the cabins of Providence Gulch, the physics of Josiah Hargrave's architecture revealed their final devastating truth. The massive timbers, those monuments to masculine confidence, had been drying in the arid plains air for years. They were seasoned, cured strong. They were also shrunken. The unprecedented cold accelerated a process that had been accumulating invisibly since the day each cabin was built. The logs contracted, gaps opened between them, some narrow as a pencil, others wide enough to admit a finger. Through these gaps, the wind entered, not as a draft, as a blade. The mud chinking which had appeared solid, which had been applied with care, which had been pointed to with pride during summer tours of the town's fine construction, froze. Frozen mud is brittle. It cracked. It fell away in chunks, leaving the gaps exposed, widening them. The iron stoves responded the only way they knew how. They consumed. Families who had been rationing their firewood, banking their fires at night, carefully measuring each day's allocation, abandoned all restraint. They fed the stoves everything they could reach: firewood, furniture, shelving, the wooden handles of tools, pages torn from books, the paper flaring bright, gone in seconds, producing a burst of warmth that the wind carried away before it could reach the far wall. The stoves roared their iron sides, glowing cherry red in the darkness of the cabins, consuming fuel at a rate that turned weeks of careful rationing into a memory within hours. The heat they produced rose immediately to the high-peaked ceilings, pooling there in a layer of warm air 6 feet above the floor, while the living space below remained at temperatures that froze water in buckets. Frostbite became epidemic within the first 24 hours. Men who ventured outside to chop frozen, unseasoned wood from the emergency reserves returned with white patches on their cheeks, their noses, the tips of their ears. The wood they brought back was green, saturated with frozen sap that hissed and spat in the stoves, producing more smoke than heat. Women wrapped children in every available textile layering blankets, Coats, curtains, tablecloths, anything that could trap a pocket of air against a small body. The children cried at first, then fell silent, a silence more frightening than any scream. The grand stone hearths, Josiah's signature, his pride proved to be the cruelest irony. Unlit to conserve the wood that the stoves were devouring, they became conduits for the cold. Their massive chimneys rising through the roofs, open to the sky, acted as thermal siphons, drawing warm air up from the interior, expelling it into the storm, replacing it with an icy downdraft that poured from the hearth opening like invisible water flowing uphill. On the second day, the roof of the Kendrick cabin on the eastern edge of town collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The Kendricks, a family of 5, had been asleep. They escaped with bruises, a broken arm suffered by the eldest boy, the clothes they were wearing. They stumbled through the storm to the church where Reverend Gideon had opened the doors to anyone who could reach them. The charity hall, that room of quiet shame where Josiah had consigned Elara 7 weeks earlier, filled within hours. The cots were occupied. The floor was occupied. People sat against the walls, pressed together for warmth, their breath forming a collective fog that hung below the ceiling. The church's stove, the largest in the gulch, consumed its fuel with the same indiscriminate hunger as every other. In the finest house in Providence Gulch, Josiah Hargrave was losing a war he had spent 12 years preparing to fight. His home had 2 stoves, both burning at maximum capacity, both consuming his private woodpile at a rate he calculated with the automatic precision of a man whose mind never stopped measuring, would exhaust it in 4 days. The windows had been covered with blankets. Rags had been stuffed into every visible gap. The front door had been barricaded with a chest of drawers, the wind having found the 1/4-inch gap between the door's bottom edge and the threshold, driving a ribbon of snow across the floor that accumulated in a miniature drift against the opposite wall. Martha was in bed. The feverish chill had taken hold on the first night of the storm, beginning as a shiver that would not stop, progressing to a deep racking cough that brought up nothing but left her gasping, then settling into a lethargy that frightened Josiah more than the cough had. She lay under every blanket in the house, her face pale against the pillow, her breathing shallow, her eyes open but focused on something beyond the ceiling, beyond the roof, beyond the storm. He brought her hot water. It was tepid by the time he carried it from the stove to the bed, a distance of 12 feet. The cold consumed the heat in transit the same way it consumed everything else. He sat beside her through the second night, feeding the stove with the mechanical regularity of a man operating a machine. Open the door, insert the wood, close the door, wait, repeat. The fire's glow painted the room in shades of orange that should have felt warm but didn't. The walls radiated cold. The floor radiated cold. The air above chest height was tolerable. Below it was dangerous. He wrapped his feet in rags, then in a blanket, then in a second blanket. The cold found its way through all of it, a patient, methodical infiltration that mocked every barrier he erected. On the third morning, the thought arrived. It came not as a revelation, but as an itch, an irritation, a persistent scratch at the back of his consciousness that he tried to ignore the way a man tries to ignore a sound in the walls of his house. The widow, the girl in the pile of rocks. He had sentenced her, not formally, not with legal authority, but with the full weight of his professional certainty, his builder's conviction, his unshakable faith in the principles he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Stone draws the cold. A woman alone cannot survive a hard winter. Folly. By now she was dead. The math was simple. A small stone structure with no stove, no firewood supply, no insulation worthy of the name exposed to temperatures that had burst a thermometer designed to measure them. She had frozen in the first hours. Perhaps in her sleep, a mercy. Perhaps awake, aware, feeling the cold close around her, the way water closes around a drowning person. Either way, she was gone. A body to be retrieved when the storm broke, to be buried in the spring when the ground thawed. A grim duty, a cautionary tale. But the thought would not settle into this comfortable shape. It kept shifting, reshaping itself, presenting its other face. What if? Two words that Josiah Hargrave had not permitted himself to think in 12 years. What if? The question was an insult to every principle he held. The stone walls of a ruin exposed to Arctic wind without a source of fuel could not sustain life. The physics were clear. He knew the physics. He had built his life on the physics. He looked at Martha. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing barely visible beneath the mountain of blankets. He looked at the stove, its iron sides still glowing, but the wood pile beside it visibly smaller than it had been an hour ago. He looked at the walls of his grand home, the dovetailed timbers he had fitted with such pride, such precision. Ice crystals were forming on the interior surface, a delicate, beautiful, deadly lacework of frost that spread across the wood like a living organism following the grain, branching, multiplying. He had built this house to protect his family. He had built every house in Providence Gulch to protect its people. He had built them bigger, thicker, grander, with each passing year pouring his grief for Thomas into every joint, every hearth, every iron stove. He had built them as an answer to the cold that had taken his son. The cold had accepted his challenge, waited 12 years, then returned with a force that made his answer look like a whisper in a hurricane. Desperation dissolved something in him. A compound that had been solid for 12 years, a rigid crystalline structure of certainty, built molecule by molecule from grief, from guilt, from the relentless need to control. It dissolved not all at once, but in stages, the way ice dissolves, not by shattering, but by yielding at the edges, thinning, becoming transparent. Then nothing. He would go to the Springhouse, not to save her, too late for that. He would go to see, to confirm, to stand over her body, to observe the evidence of physics operating exactly as he had predicted. He needed the confirmation the way a drowning man needs air, the way a man whose faith is crumbling needs to touch the altar one more time. He told Martha he would be back. She did not respond. He was not certain she heard him. He was not entirely certain she was conscious. He dressed for the storm with the methodical precision of a man preparing for his own funeral. 3 layers of wool, an oilskin coat, a heavy scarf wound around his face until only a slit remained for his eyes. Leather gloves lined with rabbit fur, a pair Martha had made for him 2 Christmases ago. He pulled a fur-lined cap down over his ears. He moved the chest of drawers away from the front door. He opened the door. The storm hit him like a fist, a physical blow to the chest that staggered him backward, that tried to throw him to the floor of his own hallway. The snow was not falling. It was a horizontal torrent, a white river flowing at the speed of a galloping horse. The cold was not a temperature. It was an assault, an entity, a predator that found the slit in his scarf within seconds, that drove ice crystals into his eyes, that wrapped itself around his body with the intimate, suffocating grip of something that intended to absorb him entirely. He stepped out. The door slammed shut behind him, caught by the wind. The sound was lost instantly, swallowed by the roar. He could not see the house he had just left. He could not see his own hand when he extended his arm. He was blind deaf, reduced to the most primitive sensory apparatus available to a human being. The feeling of ground beneath his feet, the sense of direction stored somewhere in the animal architecture of his inner ear. The knowledge that the Springhouse was northeast, half a mile uphill. He walked, he fell, he crawled, he walked again. The snow was waist-deep in places where the wind had sculpted drifts against every vertical surface. In other places, the wind had scoured the ground bare, exposing frozen earth as hard as iron. He navigated by memory, by the slope of the terrain, by the position of rocks he had known for 12 years. Twice he lost his bearings entirely, spinning in a white void without horizon, without reference point, without any evidence that a world existed beyond the 6-inch radius of visibility the storm permitted. Each time he found his way back by dropping to his knees, pressing his gloved hand to the ground, feeling for the slope. Uphill, northeast, toward the worthless hillside where a woman had built a folly. His beard froze solid within the first 5 minutes, the moisture from his breath congealing into a mask of ice that pulled at his skin. His eyelids tried to seal shut, the lashes freezing together. He pried them apart with fingers he could no longer feel. The cold had moved past the stage of pain into something beyond it, a numbness that was worse than agony because it meant the tissue was dying, the cells surrendering the body, beginning the process of strategic retreat that ended, if not reversed, in the loss of extremities, then consciousness, then life. The half-mile journey consumed nearly an hour. He measured it not in distance, but in heartbeats, each one a small explosion of effort in a chest that felt compressed by the cold. Each one a declaration that the machine was still running, though the fuel was nearly spent. He climbed the slope by feeling his boots finding the rocky ground beneath the snow, his hands grasping at the trunks of oak trees whose positions he recalled from summer rides along the track. The trees were coated in ice, their bark transformed into a surface as slick as glass. He almost walked past it. The Springhouse had disappeared. The mound of earth that Elara had piled against the north wall, the sod roof layered 3 deep with turf, the natural contour of the hillside, all of it had been unified by 6 feet of accumulated snow into a single, smooth, white surface indistinguishable from the terrain around it. It was a hill, just a hill, one more fold in the frozen landscape. The wisp of vapor saved him, a thin, barely visible plume rising from a point near the base of the mound, the outlet where the spring water exited the structure. In the white chaos of the storm, it should have been invisible, but Josiah's eyes, stripped of every other visual reference, caught the subtle difference in texture, the faint curl of warmer air meeting the frozen atmosphere, condensing, rising. He crawled toward it. He clawed through the snow, with hands that had lost all sensation, working by sight alone because his fingers could no longer report what they were touching. He found the top of the door frame. He cleared the drift away with sweeping motions of his forearms. The door was not frozen shut. It yielded when he pushed. The latch, a simple wooden bar on the inside, had been left unlatched, as though someone had been expecting a visitor. He pushed the door inward. He fell through the opening, his legs failing him at the threshold, his body pitching forward onto the packed earth floor. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He lay face down, gasping, the scarf pulled away from his mouth, his cheek pressed against the flagstone. The stone was warm, not hot, not even what a comfortable person would have called warm, but to a man who had spent an hour in temperatures that killed, who had felt the cold penetrate every layer of protection, every barrier of clothing, every defense his body could muster. The flagstone floor of the Springhouse felt like the surface of a sun-warmed rock in July. He pressed his face against it. He spread his frozen hands flat on it. He lay there breathing, feeling the heat of the earth seep into his skin through the stone, a transfer so gradual, so gentle, that it seemed less like physics than like an act of compassion. He became aware of the silence. The storm, the screaming, howling, world-erasing storm that had been his entire reality for an hour was gone. He could not hear it. The thick stone walls, sealed with clay, burned with earth, buried under 6 feet of insulating snow, had reduced the most violent blizzard in living memory to a faint, distant hum, no louder than the sound of blood in his own ears. The only sound inside the Springhouse was the spring, its water moving through the stone channel along the back wall, a continuous, unhurried murmur that seemed to belong to a different world entirely, a world beneath the world where storms were meaningless. He raised his head. His eyes, accustomed to the absolute white of the storm, could see nothing at first. The interior was dark, lit by a single candle on a wooden crate. His vision adjusted. Shapes resolved from the darkness. The stone walls, smooth with clay. The low sod ceiling, heavy, solid, absolute. The water channel glinting in the candlelight. Small clay pots arranged in a row beneath the candle-green shoots emerging from dark soil. Herbs impossibly alive growing in the belly of the earth, while the surface world above them was being scoured to bedrock. Elara was sitting on her bedroll, her back against the stone wall, mending a sock. Her movements were unhurried, the needle drawing thread through wool with the practiced rhythm of a woman performing a task she had performed 1,000 times. She wore a wool dress, a shawl over her shoulders. No mountain of furs, no visible distress. The candlelight caught her face, revealing an expression of such composed stillness that Josiah, in his frozen, half-delirious state, mistook her for a moment for a painting, a portrait of a woman at rest in a place where rest was possible. Tokala sat beside the fire pit, cross-legged, heating water in the cast-iron pot. He looked up at Josiah with the flat, unsurprised gaze of someone who had learned to expect the unexpected as a baseline condition of existence. Elara looked up from her mending. She did not startle. She did not cry out. She regarded Josiah with an expression that contained multitudes, none of them simple. Recognition, memory, the recollection of a doorway, a pronouncement, a word. Folly. Pain lived in her gaze, the residue of a wound that had not fully healed. But the pain was layered beneath something harder, something tempered by 6 weeks of labor that had transformed not just a ruin, but the woman who rebuilt it. The silence held. The spring murmured. The candle burned. The storm raged beyond the walls in another world, a world that could not touch this one. Josiah struggled to his feet. His legs trembled. His frozen clothing crackled as he moved the ice in the fabric, beginning to melt, releasing small rivulets of water that dripped onto the flagstone. He stood in the center of the small room, this 10 by 10-foot space that his professional judgment had condemned as a death trap, that his lifetime of expertise had dismissed as a pile of rocks. He turned slowly, his builder's eye cataloging everything it saw, despite the chaos in his mind. The sealed walls, not a gap visible. The sod roof, massive, insulating the snow on top, adding layer after layer of protection. The water channel at steady flow, releasing thermal energy into the stone. The cold sink by the door, that simple pit into which the frigid air from his entrance had already settled, trapped by its own density. It was a complete system, self-regulating, self-sustaining. It required no fuel. It could not be exhausted. It did not fight the winter. It had made the winter irrelevant. The word came from somewhere deeper than his throat, from somewhere below the floor of his conscious mind, from the place where Thomas lived, where grief lived, where the 12-year edifice of certainty had just finished collapsing. How? It was not a demand. It was not even a question. It was the sound a structure makes when its last load-bearing wall gives way. Elara did not answer with words. She inclined her head toward the back wall where the spring emerged from its ancient fissure. She glanced upward at the heavy roof. She looked at the floor where the water sang its quiet, endless song. She let the room speak for itself. Josiah was a builder. He could read a structure the way other men read books. He read this one in 10 seconds. He understood it in a way that went beyond the mathematical, beyond the engineering. He understood it with the part of himself that had been a freezing animal 10 minutes ago, an animal that had stumbled into warmth not by conquest, but by accident, by grace, by the charity of a woman he had thrown out into the cold. I built coffins. His voice was barely a sound, a vibration more than a vocalization directed not at Elara, but at the room, at the earth, at the ghost of a 3-year-old boy who had died in a cabin that was supposed to keep him safe. Every house, every hearth, all of it, coffins with curtains. Elara watched him. She did not contradict him. She did not comfort him. She allowed the truth to occupy the space between them, without ornament, without softening. He lowered himself to the floor. His knees struck the flagstone with a sound that echoed briefly off the sealed walls. He pressed his palms flat against the warm stone. He stayed there for a long time, a large man kneeling in a small room, built by a woman he had dismissed inside a hill. He had ridden past 100 times without a second glance, drawing warmth from a planet he had spent his life trying to defeat. When he spoke again, the professional authority was gone from his voice. What remained was raw, unfinished, the voice of a man stripped of every layer of protection except the biological minimum required for speech. Martha, she's sick. The cold is taking her. Elara set down her mending. She looked at Tokala. The boy was already moving, pulling on his moccasins, reaching for the heavy wool shirt he wore as an outer layer. He understood without translation. Urgency had its own grammar. She turned back to Josiah. Her expression shifted, not forgiveness. The word was too simple, too complete for what passed between them. What crossed her face was something more costly, something that required more strength than forgiveness, because it demanded that she set aside a legitimate grievance in the service of a principle larger than her own pain. She nodded. Once. The same nod Ada Fairfield had given her 7 weeks ago at the corner of the North Track. An acknowledgement between equals. The return journey was a resurrection conducted in reverse. Josiah led them back through the storm, his body somehow finding reserves of strength that the hour-long trek to the Springhouse had supposedly exhausted. Martha was where he had left her conscious, but barely. Her eyes opened when he entered. They widened when she saw Elara behind him, then Tokala, then the makeshift sledge they had assembled from boards pulled off the cabin's own interior walls, boards that were no longer serving any useful purpose in a structure that was failing. They wrapped Martha in every blanket. They laid her on the sledge. They pulled her out into the storm, Josiah at the front, Tokala at the rear, Elara walking beside the sledge with her hand on Martha's shoulder, a point of contact that communicated what no voice could have carried through the wind. The journey back to the Springhouse took 40 minutes. Martha was semi-conscious when they carried her through the low door, lowered her onto the bedroll Elara had prepared. The warmth of the room, that steady, modest, life-sustaining 55 degrees, received her the way the earth receives a seed, gradually, completely without judgment. By morning, others had arrived. Ada Fairfield appeared first, guided by Tokala, who had gone back out into the storm with a courage or a recklessness that Elara could not distinguish. Ada's cabin had failed during the night, the small stove burning through its last fuel at 3 in the morning, the temperature inside dropping to match the temperature outside within an hour. She arrived shaking so violently that her teeth cracked against each other, a sound audible above the murmur of the spring. Then the Kendricks, the family whose roof had collapsed, who had been sheltering in the church until the church itself began to fail, its grand steeple acting as a chimney for the cold, its high windows admitting drafts that the stove could not overcome. The father carried his youngest on his back. His wife carried the middle child. The eldest, his arms splinted with a piece of shelving, walked on his own. Then Jed Sutter. He came alone, but not for himself. He carried a girl 4 years old, the daughter of a neighbor whose cabin had become uninhabitable. The child was wrapped in his own coat, her face pressed against his neck, her small body rigid with cold. He ducked through the low doorway, saw the room, saw the people, saw the candle flame standing motionless in its impossible stillness. His eyes found Elara. Something moved in his face, something that rearranged the architecture of his features from the inside out. He did not speak. He set the child down beside the fire pit where Tokala was heating water for tea. 14 people in a 10 by 10 room. The mathematics of it should have been impossible. The air should have grown stale. The temperature should have plummeted with each opening of the door. But the spring did not care about mathematics. It flowed at its constant rate, releasing its constant warmth. The stone walls, massive dents, absorbed the cold that each new arrival brought, then slowly radiated it back as neutral warmth. The sod roof, buried under its insulating blanket of snow, maintained the seal. The cold sink by the door trapped the frigid air that entered with each arrival, preventing it from contaminating the living space. The system worked, not elegantly, not comfortably, but with the stubborn, incontrovertible reliability of the geological forces that powered it. On the fourth night, with 14 bodies pressed together on the floor in configurations that dissolved every social barrier the town had erected, something almost broke the fragile equilibrium. Mr. Polk had arrived that afternoon, half carried by Jed Sutter, his spectacles cracked, his thin frame racked with a cough that sounded like tearing cloth. His wife, a stout woman named Hester, whom Elara had never spoken to directly, came with him. When Hester saw Elara distributing the last of the smoked trout, she stopped mid-step. Her face cycled through a series of expressions, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Recognition of the woman whose home her husband's ledger had taken. Recognition that this same woman was now the reason she was alive. The two realizations collided visibly, producing a tremor in her jaw, a brightness in her eyes that was not gratitude, but something more complicated, something closer to the vertigo of having the moral ground shift beneath your feet. Elara handed her the fish without comment. Hester took it. Their fingers touched briefly over the dried strip of trout. Neither woman spoke, but something was exchanged in that contact, a current that ran beneath the surface of the transaction, altering its terms in ways that no ledger could record. On the fifth night, the cold nearly won. The temperature outside dropped to a depth that the survivors would later estimate, based on the behavior of mercury in the instruments that survived, at somewhere below -40. The spring water, that constant, tireless furnace, maintained its temperature, but the sheer volume of cold pressing against the structure from every direction began to overwhelm the system's margins. The interior temperature, which had held steady for days, dropped 3 degrees, then 2 more. The stone walls, which had been radiating their patient warmth, began to cool faster than the spring could replenish them. For the first time since completing the structure, Elara felt the cold not as a distant adversary held at bay, but as a presence in the room, subtle probing testing. She built up the cooking fire, feeding it the last of the seasoned pine Josiah had left weeks ago. Josiah, reading the situation with a builder's instinct, organized the bodies in the room, placing the children at the center, the adults in a ring around them, maximizing the thermal benefit of 14 human furnaces, each generating roughly 100 watts of body heat. Tokala sealed the door frame with strips of moss he had stored in a corner, plugging gaps so small that only his practiced fingers could find them. For 3 hours, the outcome was uncertain. The candle flame, which had been steady since the day the walls were sealed, developed a barely perceptible lean, a tiny deflection that only Elara noticed, a whisper of draft from somewhere in the system. She found it a hairline crack in the clay, chinking near the roof line, opened by the differential contraction of stone in the extreme cold. She mixed a paste from the reserve clay she had stored in a pot near the spring, climbed onto Josiah's shoulders, pressed the mixture into the crack with fingers that worked from memory because the light was too dim to see. The flame straightened. By dawn, the crisis had passed. The exterior temperature had stabilized at its brutal floor. The spring inexhaustible had slowly reclaimed the lost degrees. The stone walls warmed again, degree by reluctant degree, absorbing the fire's heat, the body's heat, the spring's heat, storing it, holding it, refusing to surrender it to the cold outside. The system had bent, but not broken. It had been tested to its limit, found the limit held. They huddled. They drank the spring water clear pure. Elara distributed her remaining stores. The rabbit jerky, the dried wild plums, the rosehip tea. The food's provenance was visible in every strip of dried meat, every flake of smoked fish. 6 weeks of snaring fishing, smoking, drying, gathering. 6 weeks of preparation by a woman the town had discarded. On the 6th night, during a brief lull when the wind dropped from a scream to a moan, Tokala spoke. He had been sitting beside the spring's source, his back against the bedrock where the water emerged. The adults had been taking turns sleeping 2 hours on, 4 hours off. Jed Sutter, who had spent time on the reservation as a young man, translated the Lakota phrases that Tokala could not render in English. His grandfather had told him about this hill. His people had wintered here for generations before the white settlement. They had understood the spring, the constant temperature, the way stone held warmth. They had built shelters against this same hillside, low structures of stacked rock, their roofs covered with earth, their interiors warmed by the flowing water. The spring house that the first settlers had built was not built on empty ground. It was built on a Lakota foundation using stones that Lakota hands had placed over a spring that Lakota memory had identified as a source of winter survival long before any European foot touched this particular fold of the Black Hills. The knowledge Elara had found in her grandmother's notebook, the Appalachian mountain wisdom of building with the earth, of using thermal mass, of trusting the planet's own heat, was not unique. It was convergent. Two people separated by a continent, by language, by every measure of culture, had arrived at the same conclusion through the same process of observation, experimentation, necessity. Build low, build heavy, build with the earth not upon it, let the planet do the work. The silence that followed Tokala's words was different from the silences that had preceded it. It was not the silence of exhaustion or fear. It was the silence of recognition, of separate threads being woven into a single understanding. The storm lasted 7 days. On the morning of the 8th, the wind stopped. Not gradually, not in stages. It stopped the way a heart stops, completely, leaving behind a silence so profound that the survivors in the Springhouse sat motionless for several minutes, unable to trust their ears, waiting for the next assault. It did not come. Elara opened the door. She had to dig upward through 4 feet of packed snow to reach the surface. Daylight poured into the tunnel. She carved a light so bright after 7 days of candlelit darkness that it brought tears. She emerged onto the surface of a transformed world. The snow stretched in every direction, sculpted by the wind, into dunes, ridges, cornices, a white desert of impossible beauty. The sky was blue, not the pale, tentative blue of an autumn afternoon. A blue so deep, so saturated, so absolute that it seemed to vibrate. The air was still cold, crystalline, tasting of ozone, of minerals, of distances. In the valley below, the roofs of Providence Gulch were visible sharp angles cutting the white surface. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin gray threads against the blue. Many chimneys produced no smoke at all. The survivors emerged one by one from the earthen mound, blinking, shielding their eyes. 14 people climbing out of a hole in a hillside, pale stuff, alive. From a distance, they might have looked like something being born. The toll became clear over the following days. 3 of the town's oldest residents had not survived, their bodies found in cabins where the stoves had gone cold. The firewood exhausted, the cold entering, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Nearly every person in the gulch bore evidence of frostbite, blackened fingertips, blistered ears, patches of dead white skin on cheeks, noses. Several cabins had sustained structural damage, roofs bowed or collapsed under the snow's weight. The communal woodpile was gone. The town's livestock, those animals not sheltered in the sturdiest barns, had frozen in their pens. The story of the Springhouse moved through the town the way the spring itself moved through the bedrock, finding every crack, every opening, flowing into every conversation. At first whispered, then spoken aloud, then repeated with the particular emphasis that people reserve for truths that rearrange their understanding of the world. Josiah Hargrave called the town council to meet on the 3rd day after the storm. The meeting was held not in the church, which was being used as a temporary shelter for the displaced, but in the open air in the town's central clearing, the snow packed hard underfoot, the sky a perfect mocking blue above. Every able-bodied person in the gulch attended. They formed a rough semicircle around the clearing, their faces raw, their clothing stained their postures, carrying the particular humility of people who have recently been reminded of their actual position in the hierarchy of natural forces. Josiah stood in the center. He was changed. The transformation was not dramatic, not the stuff of theatrical conversion. It was structural. Something in his bearing had shifted, a redistribution of weight, as though a load he had been carrying on one shoulder for 12 years had been moved to a position where it could be shared. He looked older. He looked lighter. He did not make a speech. He walked to where Elara stood at the edge of the semicircle, Tokala beside her. He reached into his coat. He drew out a single sheet of paper folded once. He unfolded it. It was the page from Mr. Polk's ledger, the one that recorded Caleb Voss's debt, $47.30. He held it up so the assembled town could see. Then he tore it in half, then in quarters. He let the pieces fall onto the snow. From the same coat, he produced a second document, the deed to the cabin to the plot Caleb had claimed. He held it out to Elara. Their eyes met. No shadow this time. No flicker. Something steady, level, clear. The gaze of a man who has looked into his own reflection in a still pool of spring water at the bottom of a room he did not build, paid in full by a wisdom greater than any currency this town has ever minted. Elara took the deed. She folded it. She placed it inside her coat against her body where it would stay warm. The spring that followed was a season of reconstruction, unlike any Providence Gulch had known. Josiah led the procession to the Springhouse on the first warm day of March. A line of men, hats and hands tools on shoulders, walking up the rocky track to the worthless hillside. Elara was waiting. The notebook lay open on the flat rock beside the spring, its pages turned to the diagrams that had saved 14 lives. "Teach us." Josiah's voice was stripped of every ornament it had carried for 54 years. What remained was the raw material, the voice of a man who wanted to learn. She taught them, not as a lecturer addresses students, as a builder addresses other builders. She spoke of how stone holds heat the way memory holds experience, slowly acquired, slowly released. She explained the difference between fighting the cold with fuel that must be constantly replenished versus negotiating with the cold through design, through materials, through an understanding of the forces at work beneath the frost line. She showed them the diagrams, the cross-sections, the annotations in Grandmother Marin's careful hand. She let them feel the walls, the floor, the temperature that did not vary. Josiah absorbed it with the ferocity of a man making up for lost time. He brought his skills to her principles. The combination produced something neither could have achieved alone. That summer, the town was remade, not demolished, not abandoned, adapted. Stone foundations sunk below the frost line. Earth bermed against north-facing walls, creating gentle slopes that children used as slides. Massive hearths replaced by smaller, smarter designs, encased in thick envelopes of stone that absorbed heat during burning, radiated it for hours after the fire died. New homes at the town's edge were built lower, humbler, nestled into the hillsides. They called them spring houses, even when no spring was present. The name had become a philosophy. Jed Sutter became the town's evangelist. He traveled to Deadwood, to Rapid City, to settlements along the Cheyenne River, carrying copies of the diagrams he had traced from Elara's notebook. He told the story wherever he went, the story of the widow who understood winter, of the pile of rocks that outperformed every proud cabin in the territory. The story traveled faster than he did, carried by word of mouth, by the particular velocity that attaches to information people need to survive. Elara never moved back into the log cabin. She stayed in the spring house, which expanded over the years, not upward but outward, burrowing deeper into the hillside. Tokala stayed with her. He learned to read. He learned to draw technical diagrams with a precision that would have impressed a Philadelphia engineer. He became the bridge between the knowledge his grandfather had carried, the knowledge that Grandmother Marin had written down, the new hybrid understanding that was emerging from the fusion of both. His drawings filled new pages, added to the notebook pages that bore his hand alongside Elara's, alongside Grandmother Marin's. A palimpsest of wisdom accumulated across cultures, across generations, across the artificial boundaries that human beings erect between different ways of knowing the same truth. Years passed. The scars on the hillsides healed. Young ponderosa pines rose in the clearings, their green a reproach to the barren years. The town's firewood consumption fell by more than half. The iron stoves, those ravenous gods, were retired one by one, replaced by efficient masonry heaters that burned a fraction of the fuel. The winter still came, fierce, unforgiving, the wind still howling through the Black Hills with the voice of something older than memory. But the people of Providence Gulch no longer feared them. They respected them. They had learned the difference. On a winter evening many years later, Elara sat in the spring house. Her hair, once brown, once shorn to bind clay, had grown back silver. Her hands, callous strong, were still warm. The notebook lay open before her on the flat rock, its original pages joined by dozens of new ones. A group of young builders from a settlement near the Bighorn Mountains, sat around her, their faces lit by candlelight, their eyes wide with the particular attention of people receiving knowledge they intend to use. She traced the diagrams with a finger that knew every line. She spoke of stone, of earth, of water. She spoke of the mountain hollows where her grandmother had learned these principles of the Lakota winter camps, where the same principles had been practiced for centuries before any European had set foot on this ground. She spoke of the convergence of the way that necessity, given enough time, always arrives at the same answers. Tokala sat beside her, a man now his face carrying the quiet authority of someone who has spent a lifetime translating between worlds. He added details in Lakota that he then rendered in English, the dual telling, creating a depth that neither language could achieve alone. Outside, the wind moved across the Black Hills. Snow fell, the temperature dropped. The spring flowed from its ancient fissure, its water rising from a depth where the concept of winter had never penetrated. The earth held its warmth, the stone remembered. The young builders listened. They would carry the knowledge home. They would build with it. They would teach it to their children, who would teach it to theirs. The thread would continue unbroken, stretching forward into a future that Elara could not see, but could feel the way she had once felt the coming cold in her bones, the way she now felt the enduring warmth in the stone against her back. They had learned what the men of Providence Gulch, with their 100 words for snow, had never possessed the vocabulary to express. That true strength was not a wall erected against the world, but a door opened into it. That survival belonged not to those who shouted loudest into the storm, but to those who pressed their ear to the ground, listened, built accordingly. That the earth, patient beyond all human conception of patience, offered its warmth freely to anyone willing to stop conquering long enough to receive it. The water flowed, the lesson continued,